Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Yesterday was Inauguration Day, and it was no doubt a difficult day for many of you. We have a new president, we have a new vice president, and we have new Congress and new Senate. I just want to remind you today of the importance of remembering an even more important Inauguration Day. I find it interesting that we have in the church essentially three different perspectives among those who profess the name of Christ. On the one hand, you have those institutions that have a saint for every day's feast and who observe every day's feast. That's one group. On the other hand, you have the sort of Puritan perspective that looks at holy days as decidedly unholy things, who refuse to acknowledge Christmas or Resurrection Sunday or any of those things. Then you've got this third group that rejects a Roman view of holy days and rejects a Puritan view of holy days and finds themselves somewhere in the middle saying, of course we can celebrate the resurrection. Of course we can celebrate the incarnation. There's nothing wrong with these things. We can celebrate Good Friday. But you know what's rarest of all? The church in that category historically has acknowledged 5 evangelical feast days. And one of the ones that's missing from even those who are in that middle category is the celebration of the ascension of Jesus Christ. Jesus ascended into heaven. We confess this in our most ancient of creeds, but we know so little about it. I suspect that most of us, when we read about the ascension in the Bible, when we think about the ascension in our minds, we look at it as simply either geographic or dimensional. That is, we think of the ascension as that time when Jesus left this earth and went up to heaven. He was lifted up. He left this place and went to that place. It's a departure. Well, it certainly includes those things, and I have no quarrel with acknowledging that. But that's not really what it's about. In fact, what's interesting is ascension, in its root meaning, is connected not with the idea of movement or travel or a shift in geography, but it's connected to the idea of sitting. When you speak, if you're a Presbyterian, about the elders of your church, when they're gathering together to rule in the church, we call them the session. That's related to ascension. The session is those who sit. Why does that matter? Is sitting is the issue? Well, we want to make sure that the people who are leading in the church are comfortable when they gather together. We don't want their legs getting tired. Is that why we talk about Jesus being seated at the right hand of the Father, so that we don't think, boy, his back's going to get sore? No, to be seated in this context is to sit in the seat of authority. Jesus' ascension was not just an elevator trip from earth to heaven. It was an investiture with all authority in heaven and on earth. It was Jesus being crowned King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I want us to remember on this earthly, temporal, only the United States Inauguration Day, that Jesus still sits on that throne. And he will always sit on that throne. His kingdom is forever. When you woke up this morning, the political head of this country was the same as when you woke up 2 days ago. Because the political head of this country is Jesus. He is in charge. And Psalm 2 promises that everyone under his authority, who does not acknowledge his authority, who does not kiss the Son, everyone, whatever party, every political authority that does not acknowledge the lordship of Christ over all things will face his wrath. So friends, be of good cheer. Don't be shaken. Don't be frightened. Don't be moved, because he hasn't moved. We come now to question number 58 from the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which reads this: what is required in the fourth commandment? The answer is the fourth commandment requires the keeping holy to God such set times as he has appointed in his word, expressly 1 whole day in 7, to be a holy Sabbath to himself. Now, I want to give a couple of principles connected to this commandment, but then I also want to open the door to some of the difficulties and challenges that come with it. First, this. We mentioned last time that the commandment calls us to work 6 days. Now it tells us to keep the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Well, that commandment is not intended to communicate something like this: that when we come and embrace our need for God's grace, or when we call upon his name, when we rest in the finished work of Christ, that now the response from him is, look, do what you want on 6 days. Just give me 1 day. It's up to you. It's your day. Do what you want. On my day, though, you need to do what I say. What I want you to understand is that there's a principle here, a synecdoche kind of principle, wherein the part represents the whole. That is, the reason we are devoting 1 day in 7 to the Lord is because all days belong to the Lord. The same principle applies to the tithe. When God calls us to bring our tithe, our tenth, to the storehouse, he's not saying, well, 90% you can do with whatever you want. The tenth is a symbol saying, this is all yours, Lord. I'm just a steward of what is yours. It's true with our money. It's also true with our time. Every day is the Lord's day. which doesn't preclude the fact that in one sense, the Lord's Day is even more the Lord's Day. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not interested in having a debate because I know I'll not do well on what day that is. So we're not going to cover that. But the principle is, nevertheless, we rest one day in 7 in obedience to God. But that's where we come up with some of the difficulties. Here's some of the difficulties. 1, when did this command begin? It's interesting that God made the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. And when we're given this command, there's a connection made between God's creation and his rest and our command. And yet, the command is not given until here. That is, we have no written history of the command to keep the Sabbath until just now. Now, in other contexts and other segments, we've talked about this distinction between what we would call creation law and something less than creation law. That, for instance, marriage is something God established for all men everywhere. Capital punishment is something God established for all men everywhere. Whether you're in his holy kingdom or not, this is what you're supposed to do. Well, where does this one fit in? Because this 6-1 pattern is given in the creation, one could argue this is a creation ordinance. It's a law for all men everywhere. Because it's not given a legal standing, so to speak, until God gives his law to the people of God as they're going into the promised land. One can argue that this is part of Jewish law. And then we have this question. Is it part of the ceremonial law, or is it part of natural law? And you can see, I trust, how those questions would relate to the previous questions. If it's a creation ordinance, it's much more likely to be natural law. If it is something given to God's people as a distinct people, then it's much more likely to be ceremonial law. And if it is ceremonial law, then is it the case that keeping the Sabbath is akin to getting circumcised or following the Old Testament sacrificial system? Well, those are some of the hardships that come with this question. And I'm probably frustrating you because I don't have answers to all these questions. I think at the end of the day, the position that I'm going to take, and we're going to keep coming back to this question in this particular segment, but at the end of the day, I'm going to take the position that there is both a creation ordinance, natural law element to this, that resting one day in 7 is something everyone should do. It's something that describes the way God made his world. There's a reason why we need to rest our fields 1 year in 7. There's a reason why we have weekends the way that we do. There's a reason why when the French Revolution tried to create 10-day weeks, it blew up in their faces. These are part of the created order, but there are also elements of the application of the natural law that I would say do fall under the ceremonial law of Israel that Jesus has fulfilled. Now, this segment is not long enough to even begin to try to unpack all of this. I'm just trying to give some guidelines, trying to raise some questions for all of us to think through. And as I say, we'll come back at least one more time to the 4th commandment as the Westminster Divines tell us what is forbidden in the 4th commandment. We may come back a time again after that. We come now to our 8th and final segment from our ongoing series, The 7 Churches in Revelation. You may recall that the reason we have 8 segments for 7 churches is that we began with an introductory segment going over the whole of the context of these announcements to these churches. So that's why on segment 8 we're now getting to the church at Laodicea. And this may be, even though Laodicea is a mouthful and not necessarily a city that we have much knowledge about in our day, this is nevertheless probably the most well-known of the 7 churches because of the profoundly graphic description that Jesus himself gives when describing the church at Laodicea. What does Jesus say about them but that they are lukewarm and they are in danger of being spit out of his mouth? Now, I've told you along the way that one of the things that I've really enjoyed learning about in preparation for these little segments is the way in which the messages to these particular churches in these particular cities actually fit together very nicely with the nature of those cities. And that is never more the case than on this particular church. I learned this very recently. Laodicea, like the other churches, was a part of this same sort of trading group and still enjoyed a high level of prosperity. Some of the others were sort of on the decline, but Laodicea was still very prosperous. But they did have a particular difficulty and challenge. In their prosperity, they were able to bring into their city a supply of fresh water through aqueducts, through sort of Roman technology. The supply of water came from outside the city, from actually hot springs. And by the time the water had traveled through these aqueducts and gotten to the city itself, it was at a place where it was lukewarm. Too hot to drink, or excuse me, too cold to drink. Oh, that's not what I'm trying to say. Not cold enough to drink and not hot enough to drink. Well, the other reason I think that Laodicea is perhaps the most well-known among the 7 churches is I can't imagine one being more closely related to the contemporary evangelical church. There's certainly overlap all along the way, but this whole idea of lukewarmness is, I think, essential to understanding the nature of the evangelical church. We are a lukewarm church. We have no zeal for Jesus. We have no passion for Jesus. We have worship systems designed to kind of gin up zeal and passion for us. But the reality is the zeal and the passion is driven by the means rather than the message. And when we go out, our Christianity gets left behind. We are lukewarm. And it may very well be that we are in the process of being spit out right now. You've heard it said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and it certainly is, but there's a corollary to that, something that flows from that same principle, and that's this: the harder Christianity is in a given culture, the stronger the Christians are in the culture. The softer it is for Christians in a given culture, the softer the Christians in that culture will be. Which means, friends, that in these United States, as we are watching the last vestiges of cultural privilege dissipate into the air, as we become more and more enemies of the culture, enemies of the state, as the secularization clamps down on us, it's going to be good for us. It's going to strengthen us. Now, some are going to run and hide, like the ones that are spit out in their lukewarmness. They're going to separate from the church. They're going to leave us. But if you are indwelt by the Holy Spirit, then you can't let go or be let go of. You're safe. You're secure. You can't be spit out. So friends, I'm asking you to cultivate a zeal and a passion for the Lordship of Jesus Christ, a desire to draw near to Him, to feast with Him, to walk with Him, to rest in Him, and not that faux religion of Americanity. I can't even say it, Americanity. It's Jesus. And Jesus said that if we follow Him, we should expect persecution. But He will hold on to us, and He will bless us, and He will reward us. And so I'm asking you, always be of good cheer. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.